Hello and welcome back to our little channel where we study the Bible through these videos. I want to read you a passage that tells of a woman of tremendous faith. It's found in John chapter 11, starting in verse 20. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Verse 24. Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world." What a tremendous statement of faith. Now this, of course, is Martha, the mother of Mary and Lazarus. And in John chapter 11, this is when we read about Lazarus' death and Jesus' resurrection of him. But this conversation was before the resurrection, while Lazarus lay dead in the tomb. But we need to go back to the very first time that we read of Mary and Martha. It's found in Luke chapter 10. Now, Mary and Martha are two of the most special women we read about in the New Testament. These are just some of the few people that it tells us specifically that Jesus loved them. Jesus is said to have loved the Apostle John, the apostle that Jesus loved, but we're also told in the scriptures that Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. These are exceptional people. So we're going to read here in Luke chapter 10, the very first time that Jesus met these people. Luke 10, starting in verse 38. And as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his words. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Tell her to help me." The Lord answered her and said, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things. But only one thing is necessary, for Mary has chosen the good part, which will not be taken away from her." We see here, now this passage is mostly about Martha, and we see a very different person than in the first passage. When Jesus first meets Martha, the first thing we need to notice is her great hospitality. She, out of all the people in the village, welcomed Jesus into their house. And she was there preparing a meal for him. But that became a burden for her. It became a stumbling block for her. She was doing what she felt she ought to, but what about her sister, Mary? She's just sitting there at the Lord's feet listening to him. And so it says she got distracted with all her preparations. And then she comes into the room where Jesus was teaching, and I can only just imagine what was going through her head. She interrupted the Lord while he was teaching and started to tell Jesus, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, what he ought to do. Tell her to help me. And that's when we get these wonderful words. Words, I think, that speak to us all. Martha, Martha, you're worried and distracted about so many things. I know that's me oftentimes. I'm worried and distracted about so many things. And this was the lesson he was giving her. He says, Mary has chosen the good part. You see, Martha was seeking to serve Jesus by her preparation, something that's very important. Jesus had to eat. He was flesh and blood like the rest of us. But at that point, Mary had chosen to serve him by doing the very thing that he wanted, for her to feed on his word as she sat down at his feet. Well, we go over to John chapter 11 next. The passage that we read of this woman who had just lost her brother. Lazarus had died and was buried in the tomb. And she states, first of all, that she believed that Jesus could have done anything. He could have saved Lazarus. Even now, whatever you ask of God, he will do to you. Jesus talks about the resurrection. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus says, I know we will all be resurrected on the last day. We can see this faith. And then she gives the good confession. She says, I know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. She understood what Jesus said. When Jesus said, Mary has chosen the good part, which will not be taken away from her. Martha had thought about that, and she realized that faith and obedience was the most important part. By putting God first and service to him. And because of that, we see the growth of her faith. We got one more passage to read. It's in John chapter 12. Immediately after our passage in John chapter 11. Notice, starting in verse 1. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And they made supper for him there. And Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of that perfume. This is such a similar scene to the one we've just read about in Luke chapter 10. Jesus is brought into the house. Martha is preparing food. Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. But at this time, she's anointing him with this precious ointment. But I want to focus on our dear Martha. This is what it says about what she's doing. Verse 2. So they made a supper for him, and Martha was serving. You see? She was doing the same thing, but she was not distracted or worried about many things. She could see that Jesus needed to be served. And that's what she was doing. That was her service to the Lord. Mary's service to the Lord was anointing his feet by sitting at his feet. We can see the growth in the faith that Martha had. We can learn a great deal from Martha and Mary. We can see why Jesus loved them so much. We need to put God first in all that we do. Other things are necessary, but we need to do it in our service to God. Well, thank you once again for your time. As always, we welcome questions and comments. Please put them down in the comment section below. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you and goodbye.